The code alarm from room 604 shattered the night shift quiet at 0347, and Katie Morrison's hands moved before her mind caught up, muscle memory taking over like a reflex that had survived 7 years of embedding in Seattle General's cardiac wing. She didn't run. Running drew attention. She walked, her pace exactly matching the rhythm of someone who knew the ward but didn't command it, though her eyes had already catalogued the distance to the Admiral's room, the placement of the crash cart, the location of the chest tube kit she'd positioned near the supply alcove 18 minutes ago, because that's what intelligence operatives do when they work nights in hospitals. They think 7 moves ahead. The ward corridors hummed with fluorescent light and the faint electronic pulse of monitors, a symphony of vital signs that Katie had learned to read like a language spoken only in the gaps between heartbeats. Most nurses heard noise. Katie heard data. She'd been at Seattle General for 6 months, ever since naval intelligence embedded her under the cover story of a career nurse seeking a transfer for family reasons. Her son Marcus, stationed on a destroyer group in the Persian Gulf, was technically family, even if the assignment paperwork had conveniently redacted that detail. The hospital had its own secrets. Irregularities in military contract billing. Phantom procedures billed to Tricare. Numbers that didn't match. Until 3 weeks ago, those numbers had been abstract, the kind of financial fraud that moved through bureaucracy like blood through veins, slow, unsteady, and invisible. Then Admiral James Halloway's name appeared on the cardiac patient roster, transferred from the Naval Hospital in San Diego for specialized treatment, and Katie's mission had shifted from white-collar crime to something that made her jaw tighten when she thought too hard about what his unexpected transfer meant. The Admiral commanded the destroyer group her son served on. The same destroyer group operating in waters that had turned hostile in the last 72 hours. Katie's role was simple: observe, document, blend in. Wear the white coat like a disguise. Keep her head down. Take the insults. She'd been doing it successfully until Dr. Pierce arrived at Seattle General 4 months ago, and his presence had created a complication that Katie hadn't anticipated, a man so focused on his own authority that he'd started paying attention to the things she did, not because he was suspicious of her, but because he was the kind of physician who couldn't stand the idea of a nurse operating with competence he couldn't explain. He'd been watching her for weeks now, his eyes tracking the way she moved, the precision of her charting, the subtle way she positioned herself in patient rooms as if she were reading the space like a tactical map. Katie entered room 604 and found the Admiral conscious but struggling, his face the color of old stone, and her hands were already reaching for the equipment before she registered that his breathing had gone shallow and his left side wasn't moving the way lungs should move when they were doing their job. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung compressing his heart like a fist closing around a piece of fruit. The oxygen saturation monitor on the wall read 73% and dropping. She could feel the moment stretching, feel the way time compressed when you'd seen this before in field hospitals in Tikrit where the electricity had been powered by generators and the medicine was always one step behind the bleeding. Need a needle, Katie said quietly, moving past the resident who stood frozen in the doorway like someone who'd memorized the textbook but had never read the chapter about what panic feels like. She didn't wait for permission. She counted ribs with the precision of hands that had done this procedure under mortar fire, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and she found the spot where the air was trying to kill the Admiral and drove a large-bore needle into it with the kind of decisiveness that made people understand they were watching someone who'd done this before. The hiss of air escaping, that sound like a tire deflating, like pressure finally releasing, and the Admiral's eyes went wider, and Katie watched the oxygen saturation climb. 75. 80. 88. 92. The monitor steadied into something almost resembling normal, and the Admiral's hand found hers and gripped it with the kind of strength people only had when they were 5 seconds away from not existing anymore. "Thank you, Captain," he whispered, and Katie felt the words hit like a physical blow. She said nothing. She disconnected from his hand and stepped back and busied herself with the 4-line that didn't need adjusting, keeping her face empty, because that one word, Captain, was the kind of detail that shouldn't have been spoken in front of an audience, and Dr. Pierce had just arrived in the doorway, his expensive shoes clicking on the linoleum floor as he walked in with the confidence of someone who'd been summoned by the code alarm, and his eyes moved from the Admiral to the needle in Katie's hand too. Her face, and something shifted behind his expression like a door opening that couldn't be closed again. Katie moved through the rest of the evening with the mechanical precision of someone following protocols, but her mind was already 3 steps ahead, already running the calculation of what Dr. Pierce had seen, what he might deduce, what he might do with information that Katie Morrison wasn't exactly who her nursing credentials claimed she was. The Admiral stabilized. The resident vomited into a trash can as predicted. The night shift continued its endless rhythm of vitals and charting and the particular exhaustion that came from holding the line between chaos and order for 8 hours without sleeping. At 0520, Katie took her break and stepped into the supply closet where the spare linens were kept and the light was dim enough that no one could see her clearly if they glanced through the small window in the door. She unhooked her badge and lifted the edge of her jacket where she'd sewn the patch 6 months ago, right before she boarded the plane to Denver and embedded herself in this hospital. Faded unit patch. The same insignia worn by the pilots of Destroyer Group 3. The same insignia her son Marcus wore on his dress uniform, the one he'd sent her in an encrypted email with the subject line that just said, "So you remember what this looks like." She touched the embroidered edges with her fingertips, and for exactly 3 seconds, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the thing she couldn't say out loud, that the Admiral's transfer wasn't random, that his cardiac condition wasn't coincidental, that whatever was happening in the waters near the Persian Gulf had prompted someone at the Pentagon to call her handler at 0200 in the morning and tell her to watch the Admiral's room because everything else was secondary now. The phone call had come through a secure line she kept in the hospital's basement server room, the kind of phone that technically shouldn't exist in a hospital where equipment was tracked and monitored. Her handler's voice had been brief, military efficient. "The Admiral's condition is compromised. Intelligence suggests coordination with foreign assets. You maintain position. You observe. You report." Nothing else. Nothing else meant Katie couldn't protect him. Nothing else meant she had to watch and wait while someone in a 3-piece suit somewhere in a building she couldn't think about made decisions that affected people on a destroyer in the Persian Gulf. Nothing else meant her son was still in those waters, still conducting operations, still alive or not alive depending on variables Katie had no control over. She tucked the patch back inside her jacket. The break room clock read 0528. She had 32 minutes before the day's shift arrived and the hospital transformed from the quiet efficiency of night operations into something louder, something with more witnesses, something where mistakes became spectacles and secrets became scandals. She stood and smoothed her scrubs and walked back out into the corridor where the fluorescent lights buzzed their endless industrial song, and that's when she saw Dr. Pierce standing near the nurse's station with his phone already in his hand, his eyes moving in the direction she'd just emerged from, his expression the kind of focused intensity that suggested someone had just realized they'd seen something they weren't meant to understand. Katie moved past him without acknowledgement. She walked to room 604 and checked the Admiral's vitals, stable, steady, the kind of rhythm that made it seem like the last hour had been a dream instead of a moment when she'd stepped out of her cover and into something that couldn't be put back. The Admiral's eyes were closed, but his hand moved on the blanket like he was reaching for something, and Katie understood the gesture as clearly as if he'd spoken it aloud. He knew. He'd heard it in her voice. He'd recognized something in the way she moved that matched the way someone in his command structure moved, the way the people who carried weight always moved, like the world didn't quite have permission to push back. She checked the monitors. Oxygen saturation 94%. Heart rate steady at 72. Blood pressure climbing back into acceptable range. The Admiral was going to survive this shift, and tomorrow the shift after that, and however many shifts it took until Katie understood what was happening in the Persian Gulf and why his presence in Seattle General mattered enough for the Pentagon to use her as a human surveillance camera. She walked back out to the nurse's station and began documenting her observations in the Admiral's chart, her handwriting as precise as always, her notes containing the kind of detail that would satisfy hospital protocols while saying nothing that couldn't be said out loud if anyone bothered to audit her work. No one would. No one ever did. But Dr. Pierce was still watching her from across the ward, his phone still in his hand, and Katie understood with the clarity of someone who'd trained for this exact moment that her days of being invisible were about to end, and that the truth was going to change everything. The ICU conference room at Seattle General smelled like stale coffee and the particular staleness of recycled air that had been breathing the same 20 residents for 6 hours straight. Dr. Pierce held Katie's patient chart like evidence at a crime scene, his voice carrying the kind of condescension that made the fluorescent light seem dimmer. "Morrison here provides an excellent example of what not to do," he announced, turning the page as though presenting a verdict. 20 residents arranged in a semicircle behind clipboards. Some smirked. One checked his watch. Katie continued taking notes in her perfectly controlled handwriting, each letter the same size, each line straight as a laser. Her pen never wavered. Never hesitated. 47 minutes documenting a routine cardiac assessment, Pierce continued, letting that number hang in the air like an accusation. 47 minutes on a stable post-op patient when the ICU census is at critical capacity. He looked up from the chart, making eye contact with the residents to ensure they understood he was teaching them. This is what happens when a nurse mistakes thoroughness for competence. When she mistakes her job, which is to facilitate my work, for actually doing medical decision-making. The residents made small sounds of agreement. One wrote something down. Katie's jaw tightened so slightly that only someone trained to read stress responses would notice. She did not look up from her notes. Perhaps Nurse Morrison would be more comfortable at a less demanding facility, Pierce said, his tone shifting into something that sounded almost gentle, which made it worse. A community clinic, perhaps. Somewhere her particular pace wouldn't impact patient flow or interfere with teaching rounds. He emphasized particular with a micro pause, letting the residents understand it was code for something undesirable. Some nurses are community-minded. Some nurses understand their lane. A female resident behind him shifted uncomfortably. Pierce didn't notice. Nurse Morrison seems to have confused her position with something more autonomous. Something more, he gestured vaguely with the chart, commanding. Katie's hands remained absolutely steady. She turned the page of her notes. She wrote the next observation. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint, and she knew how to lock that down the way a Navy SEAL locks down fear during a hostage breach. You acknowledge it, you catalog it, you file it away for later when you're alone and it won't compromise the mission. Her son's destroyer group. That was what Pierce didn't understand. That was what made this different. Admiral Harding in room 604 wasn't just a patient. Admiral Harding commanded the same destroyer group that her 16-year-old son Marcus had just been assigned to after his NG-Rock graduation. That was why she'd been embedded here. That was why Naval Intelligence had called her 6 months ago with an address and a cover story. Irregularities in military contract billing. A hospital administrator skimming TRICARE payments. A situation that required someone who could move through a civilian medical environment like a ghost while documenting evidence that would hold up in federal court. But Dr. Pierce saw a nurse who'd spent too long on a non-critical patient. The grand rounds continued for another 17 minutes, though Pierce didn't call on her again. That was part of the technique, public humiliation followed by dismissal. It was a power display, like wolves separating an animal from the herd by ignoring it after the initial attack. Katie took more notes. She documented 3 observations about a septic patient in room 607. She calculated the medication ratio for a post-cardiac patient. She did her job with the kind of precision that would have made her old commanding officer at SEAL Team Logistics proud, though that part of her didn't exist anymore. That part of her was buried under 18 months of cover, of careful deferentiality, of being the quiet nurse who showed up early and stayed late and never made waves. After rounds concluded and the residents filtered out with their clipboards and their smirks, Katie returned to the medication cart on the 4th floor. She was restocking 4 bags when Pierce found her. He'd positioned himself between her and the emergency stairwell. 2 security guards flanked him, not close enough to look like obvious intimidation, but positioned so that moving past them would require acknowledgement. A power configuration. Katie recognized it immediately. She'd learned power geometry from instructors who'd trained Delta operators. "I've been reviewing your credentials, Morrison," Pierce began, his voice lower now, more conspiratorial. Like he was doing her a favor by addressing her privately. Very impressive. Almost too impressive for someone who barely speaks during rounds. Who keeps her head down? Who documents everything obsessively? He stepped closer. The vending machine hummed behind her. Makes me wonder if everything in your file is accurate. Your background check, your nursing degree, your employment history. I've asked security to verify all of it. Shouldn't take more than a few days. He smiled. The smile of someone who believed he'd just landed a decisive blow. Katie met his eyes with Arctic calm. Her pupils didn't dilate. Her breathing remained steady. She said nothing. For 4 full seconds, she simply looked at him with the flat, empty expression of someone who'd been trained to give away nothing, not fear, not anger, not even acknowledgement. Then she turned slightly to her left, moved past him with the kind of fluid precision that made one of the security guards step back automatically, and walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She waited. She didn't glance back. Only when she reached the supply closet on the 3rd floor, a narrow space between the medication refrigerators where the fluorescent lights buzzed like angry insects, did her hand shake. Just her right hand. Just for 15 seconds. She gripped the edge of the shelving unit with her left hand and brought her right hand to her chest, pressing it against her sternum where the faded unit patch was sewn inside her jacket lining. The patch from her command. The insignia her son wore now. The same squadron that Admiral Harding led into the Persian Gulf. Her breathing came fast. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then she locked it down. The trembling stopped. Her vision cleared. She straightened her uniform, checked her reflection in the dark surface of one of the medication refrigerators, and walked back to the ICU as though the last 2 minutes hadn't happened. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Pierce had no idea what he'd just triggered. He had no concept that he'd just escalated from social humiliation to strategic offense. That evening, while Katie was still documenting her patient notes, Pierce sent an email to the nursing supervisor recommending her removal from Admiral Harding's care rotation. The subject line read, "Patient care continuity concern." The body cited a pattern of boundary issues with high-profile patients and attached carefully selected observation notes, every instance where she'd lingered at a bedside just a moment too long, every time she'd asked a question that ventured slightly beyond standard nursing scope. Selectively edited. Strategically framed. Professional enough to require formal investigation. The nursing supervisor forwarded it to HR with a flag. The flag went into Katie's personnel file, where it would sit like an infection until someone decided to lance it open. For floors below, in room 604, Admiral James Harding slept fitfully in his ICU bed, his cardiac monitor displaying the regular rhythm of someone whose heart was healing, while Katie sat in the documentation room and quietly continued the work she'd been doing for 6 months, photographing records through the screen of her personal phone, documenting anomalies. Building a case that would take down a healthcare fraud scheme worth $7 million. The irony wasn't lost on her. Pierce was trying to destroy her career by questioning her credentials at the exact moment she was assembling federal evidence against him. She photographed another document. The supply order that didn't match the inventory. 300 units of MedSupply Solutions cardiac monitoring cables billed to Tricare at $847 per unit when the actual cost was $187. The difference disappeared into accounts registered to a Delaware LLC that traced back to Pierce's wife's maiden name. Phantom procedures. Inflated supplies. A systematic bleeding of military healthcare funds that had been going on for 42 months. Her phone buzzed. A text from her naval intelligence handler, status. She replied, 1 more week. Then we move. She didn't know that 1 more week was optimistic. She didn't know that Dr. Pierce had already made the first of his calls. She didn't know that her cover, so carefully constructed, so meticulously maintained, was about to burn down like a field hospital under fire. All she knew, sitting alone in that documentation room at 0243 in the morning with the fluorescent lights humming their angry insect song, was that Marcus had texted her earlier. "My ship assignment came through, Mom. Sane Destroyer Group." Admiral Harding's group. She'd read that message 7 times. Each time, the weight of it had pressed deeper. She was here to protect Admiral Harding. She was here to save him from the people trying to steal from his command. And if Dr. Pierce got suspicious enough to dig deep enough, if her cover got blown before she documented everything, then none of it would matter. The evidence would be compromised. The case would collapse. And her son would walk onto a destroyer group with a commanding officer she'd failed to protect. The supply closet had been the moment her hand shook. The documentation room was where she locked it down and stayed locked down. Katie Morrison, the quiet ICU nurse, finished her notes and logged out. She walked back to room 604 to check the Admiral's vitals one more time before the night shift transitioned to day shift. Everything stable. Everything holding together. But the fracture had already started. The code alarm from room 604 shattered the night shift quiet at 0247, a sound like a fire alarm screaming through Katie's nervous system. She was 3 floors down reviewing Tricare billing inconsistencies when the overhead system crackled. Code blue. Room 604. Her feet moved before her brain caught up, muscle memory taking over the way it always did when lives were collapsing. The on-call resident, Dr. Chen, stood frozen in the doorway like he'd been carved from marble. Katie saw it immediately, the Admiral gasping, one hand clutching his chest, his lips turning blue as if someone had switched off the oxygen in his blood. His left side wasn't rising with each breath. The right side compensated, overdoing it, desperate. Katie's hands were already moving, already counting ribs, already reaching for the large-bore needle from the crash cart before anyone else had processed what was happening. Tension pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed like a fist closing, and now it was crushing his heart against his spine. Every second the pressure built, his cardiac output dropped further, his blood pressure plummeting toward arrest. She'd seen this before. Not in Seattle General's climate-controlled ICU, but in a trauma tent in Tikrit where the heat shimmered off the sand and dust storms turned the sky the color of old rust. Katie's voice dropped an octave. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath. Now." Not a request. Not a plea to the frozen resident. A command that made the nurse's aide jump into motion. She found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomy beneath her scarred fingertips as familiar as her own heartbeat. She'd performed this procedure in field hospitals under mortar fire, in convoy trucks with rounds snapping past the canvas, with nothing but a needle and muscle memory between life and death. The nurse's aide slapped the angiocath into her palm, and Katie counted 1 breath, 2 breaths, then drove the needle home. The hiss came immediately, compressed air rushing out like a tire deflating, like pressure being released from a wound that didn't know it was healing. The Admiral's shoulders dropped. His spine pressed back into the mattress. Color began returning to his face like someone turning up a dimmer switch, the blue receding from his lips, his eyes fluttering. "Thank you, Captain." His voice was barely a whisper, his hand gripping Katie's with the strength of a man who'd spent decades commanding destroyers and carrier strike groups. "Thank you." Then his eyes closed. His hand fell away. The monitor showed sinus rhythm, steady, strong, the electrical signature of a heart that had been seconds from stopping but was now running again. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway like a shadow stepping into light. He'd been somewhere in the hospital, pulled by the same alarm that had pulled Katie, but he'd come slowly, because he was a cardiologist and the code team was handling it, because he didn't expect to see a floor nurse performing emergency decompression procedures with the precision of someone who'd done it 200 times before. His eyes narrowed. He'd heard those last words. "Captain." Not "thank you, nurse." Not "thank you, Katie." The Admiral had used her rank, her real rank, the one hidden in the military records that Pierce was probably beginning to understand she possessed. His face shifted in that moment, confusion becoming comprehension, suspicion becoming certainty. Katie caught his stare for exactly 1 second. She didn't look away. Didn't blush. Didn't flinch. She simply continued her work, her hands moving to secure the needle, her voice steady as stone when she addressed the nurse's aide, "Get a chest X-ray. Portable." Right now. I want to confirm the lung re-expansion. Prepare a chest tube. He'll need a thoracostomy once we get imaging. The precision of her orders, the clinical language, the way she commanded the room like someone accustomed to authority, all of it registered on Pierce's face like a hand slap. He left without saying anything. But something had shifted in the room's chemistry, the air pressure changing the way it did before a storm. Katie felt it the way a dog feels thunder that hasn't arrived yet. The Admiral stabilized over the next hour. His oxygen saturation climbed from 68 to 88 to 96. His blood pressure rose from his dangerous low to 118/74. The X-ray showed the lung re-expanding beautifully, the pneumothorax reducing as the pressure inside his chest normalized. He wouldn't need the chest tube. The needle decompression had been enough. Katie checked his chart, ordered the right medications, made notes in his file with the meticulous precision she'd honed during 6 months of intelligence work, documenting everything in language that would hold up under scrutiny. At 0400, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her open the message. It was a single line, handler unavailable. Do not attempt further contact until cleared. The words hit like a fist to her sternum. Her handler didn't go dark without reason. In naval intelligence, silence meant complications. Silence meant exposure. Silence meant someone had noticed something. Katie deleted the message. Then she deleted the conversation thread. Then she walked to the supply closet on the 4th floor, the same one where she'd touched the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining the night after Pierce's vending machine confrontation, the fabric worn soft as prayer from 17 years of deployments. She pressed her palm against the denim, feeling the stitching of the squadron insignia, the same symbol her son wore half a world away on the USS George H.W. Bush. Her hands shook only when she was alone. By 0600, Dr. Pierce was sitting in the IT department with a laptop and a confidence that suggested he had clearance he shouldn't possess. He'd called in a favor with someone in administration, someone who owed him something from a diagnostic code billing scheme that Katie had already documented in the files she'd been quietly copying. The IT specialist had given him access to Katie's employee records, her background checks, her employment history, her references. And under scrutiny, everything looked wrong. The references traced back to military extensions. Her previous employment had 6-month gaps that aligned with deployment windows she could find in public military records if you knew where to look. Her nursing certifications had dates that matched suspiciously with when certain naval deployments had ended. And then he saw her log in attempt to the TRICARE billing system at 0230, just before the code in room 604. She'd been inside the military hospital system the night she'd saved the Admiral's life. She'd been digging. Pierce made the calls in sequence, each one colder than the last. To the hospital administrator at 0605, Dr. Chen saw her perform an advanced intervention without authorization. Needle decompression. That's beyond nursing scope. We need to investigate her credentials before she kills someone. To the State Licensing Board contact at 0618, I have documentation suggesting this nurse misrepresented her credentials during hiring. Her references don't check out the way they should. You might want to audit her state licensure. To hospital security at 0631, restrict building access for Katie Morrison, RN. Pending credential review. She may be accessing systems she's not authorized to use. And then the final call, the one that burned the bridge behind her completely, to a contact at a private security firm with government contracting connections. I need to report a potential security risk. A person at Seattle General may be misrepresenting their identity to access classified patient information. The patient in question is a flag officer. This could be a breach. That last call triggered automatic protocols that Katie would never see. Alerts that cascaded through government channels. Flags that blocked her handler's access to agency systems while the security breach was investigated. Reports that reached people with authority to lock down investigations and cut operative communications until they understood what had been compromised. By 0800, Katie was sitting in the HR office on the 7th floor. The director slid a termination letter across the desk like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Unauthorized advanced procedures and credential misrepresentation, the letter read. Effective immediately. Based on documentation provided by Dr. Pierce, we have no choice but to terminate your employment. Katie tried to explain. Tried to tell them about the Admiral's code, about the field medicine training, about the reason her certifications had gaps. But the director cut her off with a raised hand. Your handler isn't answering your calls, is he? We know. We called your emergency contact numbers. Those went straight to a recording about a secure line. Katie, I don't know what you are, but whatever it isn't a floor nurse at Seattle General anymore. By 09:30, she stood outside in the rain, a cold Denver morning that hammered the parking lot like applause for a performance no one had asked for. She held a cardboard box containing a cracked mug that read "World's Best Mom," a dying succulent plant from her locker that had managed to survive 3 months without proper watering, and a photograph of her late husband in his navy dress whites, taken 17 years ago in San Diego before he deployed to a place where roadside bombs didn't discriminate between officers and enlisted men. The rain soaked through her scrubs. She'd changed out of her uniform before they escorted her out, but she hadn't had time to grab a jacket. The hospital's glass doors reflected her image back at her, a woman who'd walked into the building 6 months ago as someone else entirely, and was now walking out as nobody at all. The cover was burned. The mission was over. And everything she'd sacrificed, the years of embedded intelligence work, the careful documentation of Pierce's fraud scheme, the positioning of herself as invisible, had collapsed like a lung without oxygen, like a heart without blood, like everything fragile that exists only because no one's looking closely enough to see the fractures. The rain fell in sheets across the Denver parking lot, each drop hitting the concrete like a tiny percussion instrument in an orchestra of despair. Katie Morrison sat on a bench outside the employee entrance of Seattle General, the cardboard box beside her growing darker as water soaked into its sides. Inside, a cracked mug that read "World's Best Mom," a dying succulent with leaves curling inward like fists, and a photograph of her late husband in his dress whites, his smile frozen in time before 2 tours in the Persian Gulf turned him into a name on a memorial wall instead of a man who came home. The termination papers were still warm in her pocket. She'd read them 3 times in the HR office while Dr. Pierce's meticulously forged documentation spread across the desk like an indictment. Unauthorized advanced procedures. Scope of practice violations. Credential misrepresentation. Each line a carefully constructed lie built on the truth of what she'd actually done, saved an admiral's life with the kind of precision that only comes from field hospitals and combat zones and a decade of choosing between doing things right and doing things in time. Within an hour of the admiral's stabilization, Pierce had made his calls. She'd learned afterward from a sympathetic supervisor who felt guilty about carrying out the termination. For phone calls from his office, each one a precisely calculated strike designed to sever her from everything. The first to the hospital administrator at 0815, his voice dripping with concern about patient safety. The second to the state licensing board at 0827, reporting her credentials as potentially fraudulent. The third to building security at 0834, restricting her access to the facility effective immediately. The fourth to a credentialing committee colleague at 0851, a favor owed being called in, a career being systematically dismantled by someone who understood institutional power the way a surgeon understands anatomy. Pierce had prepared documentation with the kind of thoroughness that made her stomach turn. He'd somehow obtained her personnel file and doctored it, creating a false employment history that contradicted her real credentials, fabricating dates and institutions. He'd written up incident reports for procedures he'd never witnessed, describing her actions in language designed to sound reckless rather than life-saving. He'd attached statements from residents willing to corroborate his version of events, probably threatened with poor evaluations or blocked from desired rotations if they didn't comply. The whole architecture of her cover, so carefully constructed over 6 months, had been dismantled in less time than it took to perform the procedure that had exposed her. By 0800, the escort to HR had come. A security guard who wouldn't meet her eyes, an HR representative with a sympathetic expression that rang as hollow as a ventilator with no patient attached. They'd given her 30 minutes to collect her belongings from her locker. Her hands had remained steady as she'd removed her stethoscope, her badge, the clinical reference books she'd accumulated. But when she'd reached for the jacket hanging on the hook, the one with the faded unit patch sewn deep inside the lining, the insignia of the squadron her son served within the Persian Gulf, her fingers had trembled for the first time all morning. She'd pressed her palm against it, feeling the rough stitching, the worn fabric, that last physical reminder that she'd once been something more than a nurse. The worst part hadn't been the firing. It had been the silence when she'd tried to call her handler. 3 attempts. Each one going to a voicemail that wasn't accepting messages. Then a text from an unknown number, "Do not attempt further contact. Investigation into your status is ongoing. Remain available for federal interview." Pierce had already reported her. Had already triggered the security protocols that would freeze her assets, suspend her handler relationship, potentially flag her son's security clearance. She'd protected the Admiral with field-tested emergency medicine. She documented Pierce's fraud scheme with the methodical precision of someone trained to gather intelligence. And she'd done it all wrong, because she'd done it while being watched by a man smart enough to turn her own institutional obscurity into a weapon. So here she Saturday. The cardboard box was getting soaked. The succulent wouldn't survive this rain. The mug would probably crack further if she dropped it, and at this point dropping things felt like the universe's most reliable outcome. Cars hissed past on wet pavement, their tires throwing up sheets of water that briefly obscured the streetlights. She was reaching for her phone to try her handler one more time, some desperate instinct that her training overrode, because trained operatives don't make the same mistake twice, when a voice cut through the sound of the rain like a surgical scalpel through sterile skin. "Mom, they need to see these." Marcus stood there in his NG rock dress uniform, soaking wet, his 16-year-old face set with the kind of determination that looked like it belonged to someone twice his age. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead. His shoes were mud-splattered. And in his hands, he held a shadow box, the kind that held medals under glass, heavy and official and catastrophically dangerous to everything she'd worked to build. Katie's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Marcus, no. You don't understand. You can't." But he was already moving. Already pushing past her toward the hospital entrance, already stepping out of her reach. She followed, still holding the cardboard box with her dead succulent and her cracked mug and the photograph of a man who would never know what his son was about to do. The rain hammered down harder, as if the sky itself was trying to stop them, but Marcus's stride didn't falter. He marched through the glass doors, dripping water onto the linoleum, his uniform insignia gleaming under the fluorescent lights that buzzed with the particular fatigue of a system running on empty. The morning shift handoff was happening near the information desk, clusters of nurses and residents and administrative staff creating a human current that parted slightly as a 16-year-old in dress blues approached with the kind of focused intention that made people instinctively step aside. Dr. Pierce was there, still dressed in his white coat, still radiating the particular authority of a man who'd never encountered significant consequences in his professional life. He was conferring with the hospital administrator, their voices low, probably already discussing how to manage the scandal Katie's termination might create. Pierce's jaw tightened when he saw her. Then his expression shifted to something that looked almost like amusement, as if her appearing at this moment with her wet hair and her cardboard box and her teenage son somehow confirmed something he'd already believed about her, that she was unstable, desperate, unprofessional. "You fired my mom," Marcus said. His voice was steady. 10 words, maybe 11. The kind of sentence that sounds simple until you realize it's indictment. He opened the shadow box. The lobby fell into the kind of silence that feels like it has weight, like it's physically pressing down on everyone in it. 2 silver stars. A bronze star with Valor device. A purple heart. A Navy Cross. Medals arranged in ascending order of prestige, each one reflecting the fluorescent light with a kind of brilliance that only comes from being real, from being earned, from representing something larger than institutional politics or professional reputation or the kind of institutional power that Dr. Pierce had spent his entire career accumulating. Pierce's face went the particular shade of white that comes from seeing everything you've built suddenly understood to be built on nothing. "Young man, this is inappropriate. Your mother's termination is a personnel matter, Anne." The elevator doors opened. Admiral Harding emerged in a wheelchair, pushed by a Marine corpsman in dress blue so crisp they looked like they'd never been worn before. The Admiral's face had regained some color since the night before, his eyes clear and focused, his bearing still carrying the weight of command even from a seated position. He looked at the medals in Marcus's hands. Then he looked at Katie. His eyes widened with a kind of recognition that transcended the hospital environment, that went back to places and situations and a rank he hadn't heard called in 6 months. Reaper 6, he said quietly. Her combat call sign. The name she'd used in Tikrit when her hands were steadier than her nerves and her job was keeping people alive in environments where that seemed statistically impossible. The Marine corpsman stepped forward at parade rest. He carried a printed citation, the kind of official document that changes how people understand you. When he began reading in a voice designed to carry across parade grounds and ceremony halls, across decades and distance and the particular kind of silence that comes when people realize they've been standing next to someone they didn't recognize, the words seemed to make the air pressure change. The Silver Star is awarded to Captain Catherine Morrison, United States Navy Medical Corps, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Tikrit, Iraq. He paused, letting that first sentence settle into the listening crowd. More nurses had emerged from the hallways. Residents were stopping their rounds. People who'd worked alongside Katie for 6 months, who'd seen her as simply competent, simply steady, simply the nurse who always showed up and never complained, were now learning that competent had been standing in their hospital wearing a carefully constructed civilian disguise. When Captain Morrison's convoy was struck by an improvised explosive device near Jolan district, she immediately organized casualty evacuation under sustained enemy fire. Another pause. She personally carried 3 critically wounded sailors 200 meters to the extraction point. The Marine's voice didn't waver. This was accomplished while sustaining catastrophic injuries to both legs. The gasps that rippled through the crowd sounded like wind through dry grass. Pierce's voice rose, desperate now, the strategic component of his attack suddenly revealed as insufficient. This is completely irrelevant to her fraudulent credentials and unauthorized procedures that endangered. But the words died because the main entrance doors had opened again, and FBI agents were stepping through with the kind of unhurried purpose that comes from holding all the cards and knowing it. 2 of them, their credentials already visible, their presence transforming the hospital lobby from a place of medical routine into something that felt more like a crime scene or a courtroom or the moment where everything someone spent years building collapses into nothing. The lead agent, a woman whose face looked like it had been carved from the same stone as Navy warships, approached with a folder already open. Dr. Richard Pierce, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud and wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say. Pierce was shaking his head, his voice taking on the particular desperation of someone watching their entire world transform in real time. This is absurd. I'm the chief of cardiology. You can't just. Your attempt to alter Ms. Morrison's personnel file in the hospital database last night triggered a federal investigation, the agent said, her voice cutting through his objections like a scalpel through tissue. The alterations traced back to your IP address. That led us to your emails. Her partner stepped forward with a tablet. Coordinating inflated billing schemes with MedSupply Solutions. Phantom procedures billed to Tricare over 18 months. $3.7 million. The number hung in the air like a physical thing, like something with weight and consequence and the particular gravity that comes from federal charges. The Marine corpsman continued reading the citation, his voice actually getting louder now, the medal ceremony proceeding despite the arrest happening 10 feet away, despite Pierce being handcuffed by the FBI agents, despite the hospital administrator looking like he was about to be sick into a trash can. Resulting in bilateral amputations below the knee. Captain Morrison's actions directly saved 3 lives while sacrificing her own mobility. She is hereby awarded the Silver Star. Gasps became applause. A nurse from Katie's ICU floor started clapping, the sound sharp and clear. Then another nurse. Then a resident. The applause built like something inevitable, like something that had been waiting 6 months to happen, and now that it finally had, everyone in the lobby understood they'd been standing next to a legend the whole time. Katie stood motionless, the cardboard box still in her arms, rain still dripping from her hair, her face showing nothing but that barely perceptible jaw clench. Marcus stepped beside her. The hospital administrator was stammering apologies that Pierce couldn't hear anymore because the agents were reading him his Miranda rights, their voices professional and detailed and utterly indifferent to his protestations about credentials and authority and the unjust destruction of a promising medical career. The agents perp-walked Pierce past the crowd toward the doors, his expensive shoes squeaking on wet tile, his white coat making him look like a ghost already, like a man already fading from the place he'd thought he owned. The crowd parted for them, and in that parting, Katie understood something about institutional power that she'd learned years ago in places where the institutional structures were made of sandbags and desperation and the particular kind of authority that comes from keeping people alive. Admiral Harding wheeled himself closer to Katie. "Your son tells me he's hoping for assignment to my destroyer group, the USS Stockdale. I'd be honored to have someone from your family serving with us again." Katie's voice was steady when she finally spoke. "Thank you, sir." Only Marcus saw her hand shaking as she set down the box. Only he noticed that the tremor wasn't fear anymore. It was something else entirely. Katie sat on a rain-slicked bench outside Seattle General's main entrance, the cardboard box beside her holding everything that remained of the last 6 months, a cracked mug that read "World's Best Mom," a dying succulent from her locker, a photograph of her late husband in his dress whites. Her uniform was still on beneath the civilian jacket. The rain hammered down like artillery on hot asphalt, and she didn't move. Couldn't move. The bench was cold. Everything was cold. Then footsteps. Running footsteps. Marcus appeared through the downpour still wearing his NG rock dress uniform, dark blue jacket soaked through, his 16-year-old face flushed with exertion. He was clutching a shadow box made of polished mahogany, the glass front catching the fluorescent glow spilling from the hospital lobby. He was breathing hard. His hands were shaking, not from cold, from urgency. "Mom, they need to see these." His voice cracked the way it did when he was 12, before it deepened. Before he started understanding what his mother actually was. Right now. Inside. Katie reached for him, but Marcus was already past her, already moving toward the lobby doors with the single-minded purpose of someone who'd inherited more than just her eyes. She stood without thinking, the cardboard box forgotten on the bench, and followed her son through the rain. The lobby was still lit, still humming with the rhythmic beeping of monitoring equipment somewhere deeper in the building. Dr. Pierce stood near the admissions desk conferring with the hospital administrator, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone delivering bad news with satisfaction, something about personnel files and credential verification. The administrator looked gray, exhausted, defeated. He'd already written the narrative. Katie was the threat. Katie was the problem. Marcus walked straight toward them. The shadow box was held in front of him like a flag of truce, or a weapon, or both. "You need to stop," Marcus said. His voice wasn't cracking anymore. It was steady as a sniper's breath before the trigger squeeze. Dr. Pierce turned. His expression shifted from annoyance to something else, curiosity, maybe. The kind of curiosity a predator gets when it realizes something smaller might actually have teeth. "Young man, this is hospital administration business, not." Marcus opened the shadow box. The room didn't just go quiet. It stopped. The fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder in that silence, as if they were the only thing left breathing. 2 silver stars. The metal caught the light and held it, glowing like captured starlight. Below them, a bronze star with a small V for Vela that made it mean something else, something heavier. And beneath those, like closing parentheses on a sentence no one wanted to hear, 2 purple hearts. The ribbons had faded slightly but the meaning hadn't. "Those are..." The administrator started. Marcus didn't let him finish. "Captain Catherine Morrison, United States Navy. 3 tours in Iraq. 2 silver stars for gallantry in action. Bronze star with Vela. 2 purple hearts. Bilateral combat amputations in service of the United States Armed Forces." His voice sounded like someone reading scripture. "This is my mother." The wheelchair pushed by a Marine corpsman in dress blues appeared before anyone could respond. The Admiral. Room 604. Cardiac surgery completed, stabilized on dual anticoagulation therapy, no longer clinging to the edge of an abyss. His dress uniform was perfectly pressed, navy whites, the kind of uniform you only wore for ceremonies or for moments that mattered more than ceremony. His face was lined with the texture of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that cost lives. He looked at the medals. At Marcus. At Katie standing frozen by the elevator bank. His voice came out like a command, Reaper 6. That was the call sign. Tikrit, 2007. Route farthest in West Baghdad. An IED-shaped charge that turned a Humvee into a smoking coffin and threw 3 sailors into the dust with their blood already on the concrete. She'd run through 127 degrees of heat and small arms fire to carry them back, each one a human load she'd had to calculate, 74 kilograms, 86 kilograms, 92 kilograms, and run the math in her head while rounds pinged off her armor plate. By the time she made it back, her left leg was already broken at the tibia and fibula. The right leg came later, complications from infection, bone necrosis, the body deciding it no longer needed those parts. A Marine major stepped forward with a laminated citation in his hands, dress blues sharp enough to cut paper. The lobby had maybe 40 people in it by then, night shift staff stopping their work, security guards, visitors frozen mid-stride. The major's voice was the kind of voice that had called cadence for 1,000 formations, the kind of voice that carried to the back of parade grounds. For extraordinary heroism in connection with combat operations against an enemy of the United States in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Captain Catherine Morrison, distinguishing herself by heroic achievement on 12 July 2007 near Tikrit when she displayed extraordinary bravery during an insurgent ambush that resulted in catastrophic vehicle damage and multiple personnel injuries. Without regard for her own personal safety, Captain Morrison navigated 487 meters of active enemy fire to retrieve 3 wounded sailors, carrying each individual casualty back to cover under continuous small arms and explosive fire. Her actions directly resulted in the survival of 3 personnel who would otherwise have succumbed to massive trauma injuries. Captain Morrison's extraordinary heroism, leadership, and devotion to duty, at great risk to her own life, are in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service and reflect great credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Navy. Dr. Pierce's face had gone the color of old concrete. The Admiral raised his hand in salute from the wheelchair, the gesture steady as iron, and the Marine Major saluted back. The motion hung in the air like a held breath. Every person in that lobby understood what they were watching. This wasn't insubordination. This was recognition. This was the military hierarchy acknowledging that it had been wrong, and Dr. Pierce had been catastrophically, unforgivably wrong, and that wrongness was about to have federal consequences. But that wasn't the worst part for Pierce. The main doors to the lobby burst open. Rain carried in on the wind, and 2 people in FBI field jackets stepped through with badges hanging from their necks like medals of their own. The lead agent, a woman with her dark hair pulled back so tight it changed her facial geometry, looked at a photograph on her phone, then at Dr. Pierce, then back at the photograph. Dr. James Pierce. Her voice had the texture of someone who'd had this conversation before and didn't enjoy it then either. I am, but if this is about... We're executing a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of healthcare fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, and falsification of government documents. The second agent was already moving, already reading rights in that monotone that made it sound like a parking ticket until you remembered what came after. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Dr. Pierce tried to explain. Tried to say something about investigating a security risk, about Katie's credentials, about protocol. The administrator looked at the floor. The Marine Major didn't move. The Admiral watched with the expression of someone who'd ordered airstrikes on coordinates, who understood that consequences were the cost of strategic errors. The cuffs went on with a sound like small metal applause. The perp walk happened slowly, deliberately, past the 40 people frozen in the lobby. Past Katie, who stood with Marcus beside her in his NG rock dress uniform, the shadow box still open, still showing those medals that had been hidden in a plastic storage unit under Marcus's bed because his mother never talked about Tikrit, never talked about what it cost to be extracted from combat in pieces instead of on your feet. The lead FBI agent looked at Katie as they passed. A nod. Recognition, maybe. Alliance. The invisible nod of people who did things the world didn't get to see. Dr. Pierce didn't meet anyone's eyes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they were eating his pride one photon at a time. The Admiral remained in his wheelchair, eyes on Katie's decoration ribbon, his hand still raised in the ghost of a salute. When he finally spoke, his voice carried to the back corner where the vending machine had hummed its lonely rhythm for the last 6 months. 3 sailors still serve. One's a lieutenant commander now on my destroyer in the Persian Gulf. 2 more in the Atlantic Fleet. All 3 of them had grandchildren they'd never have met if Reaper 6 hadn't run through fire. He lowered his hand. That's what I see when I look at these medals, young man. Not ribbons. Legacy. Marcus looked at his mother. For the first time in 16 years, he saw her not as a nurse who worked long shifts and came home with tired eyes, but as what she actually was. What she'd always been. What she'd been the night she'd been informed that her legs were staying in Tikrit and she was being extracted to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center. Katie didn't cry. Didn't smile. Her jaw was locked the way it got during medic training, during the worst part of triage, during the moment just before you made the decision that meant someone lived and someone else didn't. She reached into her jacket lining and touched the faded unit patch sewn into the interior, the fabric worn thin from 6 months of secret contact. I'm going on break, she said quietly. To no one. To everyone. The next morning, Naval Intelligence called. Her handler's voice came through crisp and clear, no longer blocked, no longer inaccessible. The operation was complete. Dr. Pierce's arrest had triggered a federal investigation into healthcare fraud across 17 military medical facilities, and Katie's documentation, the files she'd copied, the billing irregularities flagged in hospital databases, had become the cornerstone of a case that would ultimately recover $3.7 million in fraudulent claims. 3 FBI task forces were now activated. The Pentagon wanted her expertise. There's a new assignment, her handler said. Joint Task Force investigating military healthcare fraud across all CONUS medical contracts. Liaison officer rank. Captain's pay. You choose the duty station. Katie looked at the rain outside the Seattle General window, at the parking lot where she'd sat defeated on a bench 36 hours ago. She'd left the cardboard box there, and someone from housekeeping had moved it to Lost and Found. Denver, she said. Keep me in Denver. Understood, Captain. Welcome back. If you're settling in for a good story, you're in the right place. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what time of day it is where you are. Let's get back to it.